Hi guys, today we're going in our reader book. This is page 74. It's the Battle of the Little Bighorn. 74 is the page number. Okay, I'll read this. We're just going through the reading today. Tomorrow we'll read it and we'll do our questions after. Okay, so I'm going to begin reading it. Follow along as best you can. Take breaks if you need, but make sure you get through these readings. Okay? Battle of the Little Bighorn. The big question is, why was the Battle of the Little Bighorn important in the shared history of the European settlers and Native Americans? In previous chapters, you read about conflict between Native Americans and settlers moving west. This is the story of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. It is an event that stands out in the history of this conflict. Lieutenant Charles Varnum was awake long before Reveille that morning. In fact, he had not slept at all the night before. Remember, Reveille is the horn that wakes people up. For there was going to be a battle that day, and everyone knew it. He watched the sunrise and light fog drifting across the wide prairies of southern Montana. This was a pleasant place to be in the summertime, even if you had to wear a heavy wool uniform like Varnum and his fellow cavalrymen. So remember, imagine waking up and going, all right, today could be the day I'm going to die in battle or get taken over, be a prisoner, see my own family die. Like, that's a really, really difficult day for these people back in those days. We would just be like, oh, well, tomorrow we have a battle and I have to fight. I don't know if I could sleep that night either. The troops were camped in the little river valley. The day before, Varnum had noticed silvery rainbow trout in the nearby creek, and perhaps the thought had crossed his mind that it would be nice to spend the day fishing beside that little creek. However, Varnum knew very well that this day would hold no time for leisure or relaxation. They were at war, and the enemy was near. In fact, according to his scouts, the enemy was just on the other side. The war became known as Black Hills War because much of the fighting was in or around the Black Hills of South Dakota. Later, it was also referred to as the Great Sioux War of 1876. Lieutenant Varnum was in the 7th Cavalry Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. This was only one of the many Indian Wars and other bloody conflicts between Native Americans and the U.S. forces. So there was a lot of battles, remember. As Chief of Scouts, Lieutenant Varnum gathered intelligence or the important information about the enemy's location and the strength. Varnum had a tough ragtag group of men under his command. The scouts included warriors from the Arikara and the Crow tribes. Their people once fought the U.S. soldiers too, but they had surrendered and moved on to the reservations. Their tracking skills and knowledge of other tribes was very useful. Remember, reservations were land set aside for the natives to stay on. They couldn't have the good land because all the Europeans and U.S. settlers had taken that. But this land, if you didn't want to fight and have to maybe be imprisoned or killed, you would go to the reservations. The day before, June 25th, Varnum sent his scouts to explore the banks of the Little Bighorn River. They reported finding a very large Lakota Sioux village. They said that there were many soldiers in the village, but they did not know how many exactly. They only knew that it was a very big village with hundreds of teepees. As was his duty, Varnum reported his information to Custer, his commander. So remember, we have scouts. At this time, what would happen is scouts would go out and see where the camps were. Sometimes you'd never know that a scout had came, so they'd sneak around to see, oh, it looks like they have 500 men or whatnot. Custer wanted to see the village, so Varnum and his scouts took him to the top of the tallest nearby hill. From there, they could see smoke from the campfires, and they could see a few teepees and some horses, but not much else. Custer said he wanted to attack the village, but the Arikara and the Crow scouts protested, saying that they had never seen such a large village. Nonetheless, Custer saw this as an opportunity to deal a major blow to the enemy, and maybe even end the war, so he ordered his men to prepare for an attack. Years earlier, during the Civil War, Custer had gained a reputation for being fearless and aggressive. However, he also had a reputation for being reckless. Now remember, reckless means not really thinking about the consequences, taking big risks with the lives of his soldiers. 10 years later, Custer was still the same type of soldier. Like everyone else in the 7th Cavalry, Varnum had great respect for Custer and was proud to serve under his command. Still, Varnum could not help feeling that maybe this time Custer was being too reckless. Custer could not see the whole village from the top of that hill because it extended several miles along the river valley. He only saw the very edge of the village. Now listen, he's looking down. He's not seeing much. A couple campfires. His view doesn't get the entire picture. Beyond that, where he could not see, there were at least 10,000 Lakota Sioux camped along the river, including as many as 2,000 warriors. And the Lakota were not alone. Their allies, the Arapaho and the Cheyenne, were there as well. In the past, the tribes had often gathered in this valley of the Little Bighorn River because it was good hunting ground, and there was plenty of water nearby. In 1876, with war raging all around, they were all gathered in this place. Amongst the thousands gathered were a famous Lakota holy man named Sitting Bull, along with a great warrior chief named Crazy Horse. Many members of the Lakota had tried to live on the reservations. They had signed the treaties with the federal government. The treaties said it was their land and nobody else's. But settlers moved in anyway, and the reservations kept getting smaller and smaller. At last, the Lakota left the reservations. They packed up their teepees and traveled across the plains into Wyoming and Montana to hunt buffalo and live free. Of course, the U.S. government wanted them to go back to the reservations. They told the Lakota to return by midnight on January 31st, 1876, or that there would be war. So the Lakota don't want to go to these reservations. They said, here is your land. They took the land. They accepted the land. Then, settlers keep moving into this land that they were given. Next thing you know, the reservation's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And more people are on it because the tribes aren't getting smaller, but the land's getting less and less. The Lakota did not return to the reservations, and the Black Hills War started the next day. So it's the Battle of the Black Hills. Sitting Bull was a famous spiritual leader, known among all the Lakota and their allies. He told his people to have courage in their war against the Washoe. That is what the Lakota called the soldiers and settlers, the Washoe. The true meaning of this word is not certain, though some have concluded that it means person who takes the fat, or someone who's greedy. Anxious and uncertain of their future, the tribes gathered in this valley in the early summer of 1876 because Sitting Bull was going to perform a Sundance. The Sundance was an ancient sacred ritual. During the Sundance, Sitting Bull prayed for a vision of the future. He asked the spirits what would happen to his people. Sitting Bull predicted that the Lakota would win a great victory in battle. So he's talking to the gods, and the gods are telling him, you will win a great victory. Sitting Bull was not the only important leader in the great village of the Little Bighorn that day. Crazy Horse was there as well. In some ways, Crazy Horse was a little bit like Custer, bold and reckless. In battle, he rode straight at the enemy, but no arrows or bullet ever found him. All the warriors were happy to follow Crazy Horse wherever he went because he always found victory. So here's pictures. This is Sitting Bull, and this is Crazy Horse at the bottom. You have them on your book. That's what I just finished reading this page 77. This one up here is Sitting Bull. This one's Crazy Horse down there. He looks like he's ready to battle. Page 78. After talking with Varnum and his scouts, Custer ordered his troops to prepare to attack the village. Custer planned a surprise attack, but he soon realized that this was impossible. After all, the Lakota had their scouts too. and it's not easy to hide a cavalry regiment for very long out on the plains. The regiment had 11 companies, each with around 50 or 60 men. So I can do that math for you now. It's like 550 men, maybe 660 men, not a ton. Custer divided the regiment into 3 brigades, or groups of companies. He sent 3 companies with Captain Benteen and another 3 companies with Major Reno. Custer kept the largest force of 5 companies, totaling 210 men. So what number did the Lakota tribe have? Over 10,000, and over 2,000 were warriors. This guy has 210 in one group, and then he's got a bunch of other ones that might total 600 people under his direct command. At first, Lieutenant Varnum was a little disappointed when he learned that he was going with Reno's force. Varnum wanted to ride with Custer in the main force with most people. So now a real quick math thing. If we have about 600 people and they have 12,000 people, that means on average each person has to kill 20 Lakota tribes. 20 individual natives in order for that to work out for them. Does that sound easy? No way. Custer did take several of the Varnum scouts because he needed them to guide him to the village. The Arikara and Crow had long been enemies of Lakota since the days before any Europeans knew about America. Therefore, Varnum's scouts were willing to go and fight with Custer. However, as he was riding out with Reno's troops, Varnum saw his scouts preparing for battle. They were singing their death songs, which meant that they did not expect to survive the day. So that's what the scouts are doing. They're singing death songs. They know that this is a very reckless choice to go and try to attack these people. Custer took his brigade to the north along the right bank of the Little Bighorn River, looking for a good place to cross and attack the village. Reno crossed over to the left bank, and his troops moved north on the far side of the river. Soon, scouts were reporting that the Lakota knew the soldiers were coming, and they were not running away. Custer sent a messenger to Reno and ordered him to attack the village and force the Lakota to come out and fight. Custer, meanwhile, was a mile or so upriver, and he planned to attack at the same time, creating chaos and confusion in the village. Reno's brigade dismounted from their horses, so they got off their horses, and approached a few teepees on the edge of the village. They moved forward in a line, cautiously, with the troops up front and the officers, including Lieutenant Varnum, to the rear. As they approached the village, Varnum saw children running away. Several women mounted the horses, and they were the first ones to ride out and shoot at soldiers. Then the warriors arrived. At first, there were only a few. They hid in the tall grass and fired their guns from a distance. So as these soldiers are coming in, the warriors almost have them surrounded. Now they're firing in the grass. Reno's soldiers and the Lakota shot back and forth for about 20 minutes. One of Reno's men was wounded during this time, but that was all. However, Lieutenant Varnum was a trained and experienced scout, which means he had good eyes and a good sense of what was happening around him. He realized that the Lakota warriors were gathering behind a nearby hill. Varnum sent a scout to see, and sure enough, he reported that there were at least 500 warriors there. Before Varnum could warn Reno, the warriors rolled their horses around from behind the hill. The ground shook and the air filled with their war cries as warriors swarmed towards Reno's brigade. Bullets and arrows whizzed all around, and then the soldiers began to fall. Panic and fear spread through Reno's brigade. Page 80 around shows this picture up here at the top. As they realized that they were outnumbered, Reno also panicked. He ordered his men to mount their horses, but then he ordered them to dismount, and then to mount again. Imagine how confusing that is. Mount your horses. Get on it. No, get off your horses. Get back on it. Sounds like a funny cartoon. At last, he simply ordered everyone to retreat, and that means that they all ran or rode away as fast as they could. They reached the top of a hill, but the Lakota were everywhere. That might have been the end of Reno and his men, except Captain Bennett's brigade happened to appear at just the right moment. Today, that hill is called Reno's Hill. Reno and Bennett stayed on that hill the rest of that day, all night and into next day. All the while they expected Custer and his men to ride to the rescue at any moment. So Reno's Hill, they're at the top of the hill. Finally get their group together, but we're still waiting for Custer. We have to stay there all night just trying to survive. Custer never made it across the Little Bighorn River. He tried, but before he and his men were halfway across, all the rest of the warriors from that huge village came out to meet them. The only survivors of that fight, the only ones who lived to tell the story of Custer's last stand, were Native American warriors. Custer and every one of his men died that day. As to what exactly happened to Custer, there are a few different stories. Most seem to agree on a few details, though. The Lakota attacked Custer and his men as they crossed the river. Many of the men died there in the water. The rest probably broke into smaller groups of 20 or 30 men. Most of the fighting was over within a few minutes. Custer and some of his men probably made it to the top of a small hill. There, they may have formed a circle in a little while longer before totally being overrun. After Custer was dead, all the warriors went back and attacked Reno and Benteen and their men. They fought all the rest of the day and into the night. The fighting began again the next morning, but the Lakota learned that more army soldiers were coming. Soon after, the Lakota broke camp and scattered across the plains once again, and the war continued. Sitting Bull's prediction was correct. Crazy Horse and the Lakota warriors did win a great victory that day. It was their last great victory, though. Less than a year later, in May of 1877, after many more battles, Crazy Horse and the last of his warriors finally surrendered to the Washoe, which were the Europeans or Americans. As for Lieutenant Varnum, he remained in the cavalry for many years and continued to fight the few remaining Lakota and other people who dared to resist. In 1890, he won the nation's highest military award, the Medal of Honor, for his actions fighting the Sioux one last time near a place called Wounded Knee. So tomorrow we'll do the questions. Chapter 10 is coming up, and that one's called The Taking of the Land. How many? That might be almost the last chapter in this book. And then we'll read a couple other things, okay? Whew. That was a good chapter. That's for sure.